Hi, this is Dr. Frank Chopatini with the Church of Rational Truth. First, before I get started with our lecture today, I want to just cover a little bit of old business like usual. The voting is in, and the passive income from last week is going to be going towards funding the church and library. So that's going to go towards that sub part of the endowment to hopefully furnish that for the future and hopefully pay for that. This week's lecture is going to be a little bit different than past lectures. A lot of our past lectures were more based on hard concepts, more factual things. This lecture is going to be philosophical in nature. And the topic is, adjust this, does your physics professor know more about God or understand more about God than you? And obviously, that's a little bit clickbaity, that's a little bit controversial, but it's an interesting concept. And I am not going to approach this from a scripture standpoint. I'm going to do this purely philosophically. So if people who are listening to this, they're going to go, well, this isn't in the Bible. Nowhere does this say this. What are you backing this up with? This isn't at all about scripture. This is about a philosophical question. And it is based on a couple of suppositions. This isn't out of nowhere. This isn't just making things up. I also want to preface this with this is not an official stance of the church. This is not us saying that there is a God. This is not us saying that that we believe these as tenets. This is just a argument in philosophy or a practice in making a logical argument about some concepts about religion and God. And so first I want to kind of start with what this argument is based on, or what do we have to make in terms of assumptions to make this argument, because it really falls apart if you don't make these assumptions. And the first assumption is that there is a God or supreme being. So that is one big giant supposition that we have to make. We have to assume that that is true to follow out this logical argument. If not, obviously, it's null and void. So that is the first big supposition that we have to make. The second is that God is the creator of the physical world, all the rules of the physical world, and is capable of interacting, or could be capable of interacting with that physical world. That is the second one. And I would say many people or many religions or religious doctrines are in accordance with those. I would say many religions say that there is a creator. He made the world. He is omnipotent, all powerful. He's capable of doing anything and knowing everything, controlling everything. So I would say those aren't, in most religious tenets or religious doctrines, those don't seem like they're ridiculous suppositions to make. Those aren't ridiculous bases to start with this philosophical question. So if we make those assumptions, then I would make the argument that for the vast majority of people, their physics professor would know more or understand more about the workings of God than they do, just because of that basis. The reason for this is because people who study physics or physics professors, they understand the rules of the world. They understand the physical nature of the world we live in. We live in a physical realm. We have physical objects, and they have rules. And what do people who, I keep wanting to say physicians, which is going to get very confusing. What do people who study physics study? They study the interactions between things in the physical world. They measure them, they understand them, they create rules, they try to study them and understand how they act or how they function. Because that is their job, they would therefore have a very good understanding on how this supposed God functions. If this God functions and interacts with the world and is capable of creating this world with rules, people who study physics are studying those rules. They'd be studying the rules that God made. If that God is interacting with that world, people who study physics would be able to also study that interaction. So if you were going to make an argument of who understands God, you would want to go to a physics professor. You would want to go to someone who knows physics, because they are looking and studying immediately at the things God would be doing in that physical world. They would understand what God is doing in that physical world. That is completely different than understanding scripture. That is completely different than understanding what exactly the God does. But they would be able to go back, they would be able to, through their understanding of how the physical world functions, therefore understand and actually see how God works or how God functions, because they can measure the changes in the physical world. If God were to come, or if this God in this argument were to come and make changes or adjustments in this physical world, because the world is physical and those things can be measured, I keep saying physicians, people who study physics would be able to measure those things. They'd be able to understand those things. They'd be able to see those things, graph those things. They'd be able to predict those things. They would be able to actually show physical proof of those things. So I would argue that if there is going to be anyone who understands God or the concepts of what a God or being would be able to do, it would be someone who studies physics. I would even argue the profession that has the most power or the most godlike abilities would be someone who has mastered physics. And you can even see that in our history. If you've seen giant leaps forward in the progress of mankind, both in power and ability, they usually are associated with giant jumps in our knowledge in physics. It's not always true. We make giant jumps in medicine, we make giant jumps in other sciences, but the times where man has almost gotten a scary level of power or godlike control has been with a correlated understanding of the physical concepts behind reality. The big one that is jumping out as a evidence of this argument is the entrance into the atomic era. When we started to learn more about the atom and harnessing the power of the atom, that was the closest we got to having a single person have almost godlike control of things. You could go and either harness that knowledge of how the physical world works to help mankind, to create energy, to fuel cities, to create common good, or you could do the exact opposite. You could do that to destroy entire civilizations, to kill hundreds of thousands of people in a millisecond, just by what you end up doing with the knowledge of how atomic energy works. You're not going to get that power from necessarily a mathematician. I'm sure they help. You're not going to get that power from studying religion. You're not going to get that from a priest. There is no one who has, in the history of mankind, been able to harness knowledge of religion or scripture and then be able to wipe out hundreds of thousands of people in an instant. That's just not possible. But people who study physics can. If you want to see someone who has godlike power, I would not look at a pope. I would not look at a bishop, an archbishop. I would look at someone who has mastered physics and who can control physics. That person is much more scary to me. That person is much more powerful to me because they understand how this physical world works and they can manipulate it. That is kind of what my argument would be, is that if you actually wanted someone who understood how God functions, you would look towards a physician. Now, obviously, you have to base it on those conclusions, and those may or may not be true. A lot of people would argue so. A lot of people would argue, well, we don't really have any evidence that necessarily exists, and this whole thing does fall apart. But I would say if you want to understand the physical nature of the world and how it functions, and if you were to actually try to measure God and God's ability to do things on the earth, you would do it with physics. You would go to someone who studies the physical world, and they would be able to mathematically, empirically show you the evidence of these are the interactions and the movements of this God who is functioning in the physical world. Hopefully this wasn't too much of a long and boring conversation. Hopefully it stimulates some conversation, or at least lets people see things in a kind of different way. I don't think a lot of people try to see both religion and physical sciences being able to work together, but I would argue that they're dramatically intertwined, that you cannot remove the two. But hopefully this has stimulated some internal thought and maybe some discussion. I know this lecture was a little late, not doing it on a Sunday like normal, but we'll come back hopefully next Sunday with a new lecture. If you guys have any topics or things that you'd like us to talk about in future lectures, please let us know in the comments. And thank you so much for watching. This is again Dr. Frank with the Church of Rational Truth. Y'all stay well and have a great week.